The year was 1871, and time itself seemed to move differently in Harwick, Alabama. Not faster, not slower, but with a particular kind of weight, the kind that settles into a town's bones after years of war, loss, and quiet suffering. The air carried the faint acrid scent of ash and defeat, mingling with the heavy sweet perfume of magnolias and the ever-present dust kicked up by wagon wheels on unpaved roads. If you stood still long enough on the main street of Harwick, you could almost hear the town breathing, a slow, labored exhale of a place still healing from wounds that refused to close. The Civil War had ended 6 years prior, but its shadow stretched long and cold over every family, every field, every weary soul. The men who had marched off in Confederate gray had returned, if they returned at all, with hollow eyes and haunted silences. Their bodies were often broken, their spirits irrevocably scarred by things they had seen and done in fields that were never meant to become graveyards. The women who had kept the home fires burning with dwindling resources and mounting anxieties now faced a future that felt both alien and impossibly bleak. The economy of Harwick, like so many southern towns, was bound inextricably to cotton. Fields stretched out under the relentless Alabama sun, their white bowls a promise of prosperity that rarely materialized for the common farmer. Sharecropping was the new reality for many, a cycle of debt and dependence that replaced one form of servitude with another. The town itself was a modest collection of clapboard houses, most in various states of disrepair, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A single dusty main street boasted a general store, its shelves sparsely stocked, but its proprietor, old Mr. Abernathy, always ready with a piece of gossip or a sympathetic ear. There was a blacksmith, his hammer ringing out a rhythmic clang that punctuated the quiet afternoons, and a small, unassuming post office where letters from distant relatives were eagerly awaited, often bringing news of hardship rather than fortune. At the heart of Harwick, both geographically and spiritually, stood the First Baptist Church, its steeple reaching toward the heavens like a desperate plea. On Sundays, its pews would fill with the town's inhabitants, seeking solace, guidance, and a sense of community in the fiery sermons of Reverend Tate, whose voice could thunder like a summer storm or soothe like a gentle breeze, depending on the perceived moral failings of his flock. Life was hard, unyielding, and deeply traditional. Change came slowly in Harwick, if it came at all, and anything out of the ordinary was scrutinized, discussed, and most often feared. It was into this world, this tired, watchful, suspicious little world, that Elias Vance and his daughter Nora lived. And it was here, in this unremarkable corner of Alabama, that a mystery would take root so quietly, so gradually, that by the time anyone truly understood what they were looking at, it was almost too late. Their home, a 2-story farmhouse, stood a mile or so outside the main cluster of Harwick, nestled among a small grove of ancient oak trees. It was a handsome house once, built with care and pride, but now it wore a coat of faded gray paint and a quiet air of neglect, as if mourning alongside its owner. Elias Vance was a man forged in the crucible of war, a former Confederate officer who had returned from the battlefields of Virginia, a changed man. He was tall, gaunt, with a severe jawline and eyes that seemed perpetually shadowed, even in the brightest sunlight. His hair, once a rich brown, was now streaked with premature gray, pulled back neatly from a high forehead. He moved with a stiff, almost military precision, his shoulders perpetually squared, his gaze direct but uninviting. In public, Elias was a man of few words. He would come to town for supplies, his buggy rattling along the dusty road, and conduct his business with a quiet efficiency that discouraged idle chatter. He paid his debts promptly, nodded curtly to those he passed, and offered only the briefest of pleasantries. He was respected in a distant, wary way for his service in the war and for his unwavering stoicism in the face of personal tragedy. Everyone knew he had lost his beloved wife, Clara, during the war years, a loss that seemed to have hollowed him out entirely, leaving only a shell of the man he once was. He was seen as a man of principle, if a somber one, and his reclusiveness was attributed to grief. Simple, understandable grief, but no one truly understood what was happening inside the walls of that faded gray farmhouse. Not yet. At home, the silence of the Vance farmhouse was a different kind of beast. It was a silence born not of peace, but of suffocating control. Elias's routines were meticulous, almost ritualistic. He would rise before dawn, tend to his small plot of cotton and corn, and then return to the house where he would prepare Nora's breakfast. Nora, his only child, was a wisp of a girl, small for her age, with delicate features and hair the color of spun moonlight. Her eyes, however, were her most striking feature, a deep, intelligent blue that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, or perhaps an ancient sorrow that no child should carry. She moved through the house with an unnerving stillness, her footsteps barely audible on the worn floorboards. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, almost a whisper, as if she feared disturbing the fragile peace that Elias so carefully maintained. Nora was, by all accounts, a well-behaved child. Too well-behaved, some might have whispered, had they dared speak their thoughts aloud. She was always neatly dressed, her clothes simple but clean, her hair always perfectly braided. She spent her days reading the few books Elias possessed, or sketching in a worn notebook, her delicate hands moving with a quiet grace. She rarely played outside, and when she did, it was always within the confines of the Vance property, under the watchful, ever-present eye of her father. The townspeople saw her as a quiet, almost ethereal child, a fragile bloom in a harsh world. They pitied her for the loss of her mother and for the somber life she led with her reclusive father. They did not yet see the unsettling truth that was slowly, subtly beginning to manifest itself, a truth that would shatter the quiet facade of the Vance household and expose a darkness that no one in Harwick was prepared to comprehend. The first shadow, faint and almost imperceptible, began to lengthen in the spring of 1875. 4 years had passed, 4 years since Nora Vance was last truly seen as a child of 10. Now, by the calendar, she should have been 14, on the cusp of womanhood, her body beginning to betray the subtle shifts and curves that marked the transition from girl to young lady. But Nora remained stubbornly, unnervingly the same, and it was Mabel Prout, a woman built for observation, who first noticed. Mabel was a fixture at the general store, her basket always full of the week's necessities, her ears always open to the currents of town gossip. She had known Nora Vance since the child was born, had seen her toddle, then walk, then grow into a quiet, pale girl. But something had stopped. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and humid, the kind of day that made the air thick and heavy, when Mabel saw Nora in town. Elias had brought her in, as he occasionally did, to pick up a new spool of thread or a small packet of seeds. Nora stood beside her father, a silent, almost translucent figure in a simple calico dress. Her hair, still the color of moonlight, was braided down her back, and her face, framed by soft wisps that had escaped the braid, was smooth, unlined, and utterly childlike. Mabel watched her. Then she glanced at her own daughter, Sarah, who was a year younger than Nora. Sarah was all gangly limbs and burgeoning curves, her voice beginning to deepen, her face breaking out in the occasional spot. She was growing, changing, blossoming into adolescence in the way that nature intended. But Nora was not. Her height seemed unchanged from 2, even 3 years prior. Her hands were still small, her wrists slender as a bird's bones. Her chest remained flat, her hips narrow. It was as if time, in its infinite wisdom, had simply forgotten to touch her. Mabel felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that started in her stomach and spread outward through her veins. It wasn't just that Nora looked young. It was that she looked exactly the same delicate features, the same wide blue eyes, the same unnerving stillness. It was as if she had been preserved, like a specimen in a jar, untouched by the natural progression of years. That evening, as the crickets began their nightly symphony, Mabel sat on her porch, fanning herself with a palmetto fan. Her husband Thomas, a kind but often oblivious man, was whittling a piece of cedar beside her. "Thomas," Mabel began, her voice low, "did you see Nora Vance today?" Thomas grunted, his knife carving a delicate curl from the wood. "Saw her with Elias at the store. Quiet as ever." "She's not growing, Thomas," Mabel stated, her voice tight with a certainty that brooked no argument. "She's 14 years old, and she looks no older than 10. Maybe 11 at a push." Thomas paused his whittling, looking up with a furrowed brow. "No, Mabel. Girls grow at their own pace. Some are late bloomers. You know that?" "This ain't about late blooming, Thomas," Mabel insisted, her fan stilling. "This is unnatural. I've seen enough children grow up in this town to know what's natural and what ain't." Her face, her size, her everything. It's like she's stuck, frozen. Thomas, a practical man, shrugged. "Elias keeps her close. Maybe she just ain't getting enough sun or good food. He's a strange one, that Elias, since Clara passed." Mabel scoffed quietly. "It's more than that. It's a feeling, Thomas. A cold feeling." The next day, Mabel's unease solidified into conviction. At the dry goods store, while examining bolts of fabric, she encountered Mrs. Henderson, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper observations. "Mabel, you seen Nora Vance lately?" Mrs. Henderson whispered, leaning in conspiratorially, her eyes darting around the sparsely populated store. Mabel straightened, a flicker of grim satisfaction in her eyes. "I did. Just yesterday. And I've been thinking on it. She ain't changed a bit, has she?" Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice barely audible. "My Martha, she's only a year older, and she's already got suitors sniffing around. But Nora, she's still a child. A little doll. A doll that don't age." Mabel finished, a shiver running down her spine despite the heat. "It ain't right, Mrs. Henderson. It just ain't right." The seed of suspicion, once planted, began to sprout with alarming speed. The women of Harwick, with their keen eyes and even keener ears, began to notice. At church, during the brief moments Nora was present, hushed whispers would ripple through the pews. "She's so small for her age. Looks just like she did 3 years ago. Poor child, always so pale." The whispers were not malicious, not yet, but they carried an undercurrent of fear of the unknown. Reverend Tate, a man acutely attuned to the spiritual pulse of his congregation, could feel the shift. He saw the furtive glances toward the Vance pew, the uneasy murmurs. He understood that something was unsettling his flock, something that defied the natural order. And so, the following Sunday, his sermon took on a new, more ominous tone. His voice, usually booming with righteous fervor, began with a low, resonant hum that commanded the attention of every person in that church. "My brethren, we live in a world of God's divine order. The seasons turn, the crops grow, the children blossom into men and women just as the Lord intended. But sometimes," he paused, his gaze sweeping across the congregation, lingering for a moment, perhaps on the quiet, still figure of Nora Vance, though he never named her. "Sometimes the natural order is disturbed. Sometimes things appear that defy explanation, that stand outside the Lord's design." He spoke of the dangers of vanity, of trying to halt the hand of time, of tampering with God's will. He spoke of blessings and curses, of the mysterious ways the Almighty might choose to manifest His displeasure or His divine intervention. He did not accuse, not directly, but his words painted a vivid picture of an anomaly, a deviation that could only be interpreted as either a sign from above or a dark omen from somewhere else entirely. The atmosphere in the church grew heavy, thick with unspoken fears. The town, already struggling with the aftermath of war and the harsh realities of daily life, now had a new unsettling mystery to contend with. The whispers turned to hushed theories, some invoking witchcraft, others divine punishment. The quiet, pale girl from the Vance farm was no longer just a quiet, pale girl. She was becoming a symbol, a question mark, a source of growing dread in the heart of Harwick. And the shadow, once faint, now stretched long and dark across the entire community. Dr. Ambrose Holt was a man of science, a beacon of rationality in a town often swayed by superstition and rumor. His office, located in a small, well-maintained building just off the main street, was a testament to his methodical nature. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a blend of modern medicine and traditional remedies. His instruments, though rudimentary by today's standards, were meticulously arranged. Gleaming scalpels, a polished stethoscope, glass vials filled with various tinctures, and a microscope, a marvel of technology that allowed him to peer into the unseen world of cells and microbes. He kept a small leather-bound journal on his desk, its pages filled with precise observations, diagnoses, and the occasional frustrated query. Dr. Holt had trained in Philadelphia, a city far removed from the dusty roads of Harwick, and had returned to his native Alabama with a deep-seated belief in the power of observation, logic, and empirical evidence. He treated all ailments, from the common cold to the more serious fevers that swept through the town, with the same unwavering dedication to understanding the underlying cause. It was in the late summer of 1875, amidst the growing whispers about Nora Vance, that Elias Vance himself sought out Dr. Holt. Elias arrived at the doctor's office in his usual quiet manner, his face impassive, his posture rigid. He requested a full examination of his daughter, stating with a chilling lack of emotion that the child seemed to be developing slowly and that there were rumors. It was a preemptive strike, a calculated move to quell the rising tide of speculation, to present a medical explanation for what the town perceived as an anomaly. Dr. Holt agreed. His professional curiosity piqued. He had heard the whispers, of course, but had dismissed them as the usual small town gossip, exaggerated and unfounded. He expected to find a slightly underdeveloped girl, perhaps suffering from malnutrition or a chronic illness. Nothing more. The examination took place a few days later in the quiet, sterile environment of Dr. Holt's office. Nora Vance sat on the examination table, her small feet dangling, her hands clasped in her lap. She was, as always, unnervingly still, her blue eyes following Dr. Holt's movements with an intelligent, almost knowing gaze. Elias stood in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel, his presence a heavy weight in the small space. Dr. Holt began his examination methodically. He measured her height, a mere 4 feet 8 inches, a stature more suited to a girl of 10 or 11. He weighed her, a feather light 75 pounds. He noted the fine, almost translucent quality of her skin, the lack of any adolescent blemishes. He checked her teeth, noting their small size, the absence of wisdom teeth, and the general appearance of a younger dentition. He palpated her bones, feeling the delicate structure of her wrists, her ankles, her ribs. There was no sign of the robust growth spurts typical of a girl her age. He then moved to more intimate observations, his professional demeanor masking a growing sense of unease. He noted the complete absence of secondary sexual characteristics. Her chest was flat, her hips narrow, her body utterly devoid of the subtle curves that marked the onset of puberty. Her voice, when she answered his questions about her general health, was soft, high-pitched, and childlike. She reported no menstrual cycles, no bodily changes whatsoever. Dr. Holt's brow furrowed deeper with each observation. Medically, Nora Vance presented as a girl of 10 or 11, perhaps 12 at the very oldest. Yet Elias had stated unequivocally that she was 14. The discrepancy was stark, undeniable. It defied every medical textbook, every physiological understanding of human development. He made his notes in his journal that evening, his usually neat handwriting betraying a slight tremor. Patient Nora Vance, age 14 years, per Father Elias Vance. Apparent age, 10 to 11 years. Height 4 feet 8. Weight 75 pounds. Skin fine, pale, no adolescent changes. Dentition consistent with younger age. Secondary sexual characteristics absent. General health appears delicate, but no overt signs of illness. No reported menstrual cycles. Observations developmental arrest. Cause unknown. No obvious pathology. Patient is quiet, compliant, intelligent. Father Elias Vance present throughout. Demeanor controlled, precise, almost detached. An unsettling case. Requires further observation. A profound anomaly. But the uneasy feeling he could not shake was not just professional frustration. It was a deeper, more primal sense that something was profoundly wrong. Something that transcended mere medical mystery. It was the feeling of looking at a puzzle with missing pieces, but knowing with a chilling certainty that those pieces had not simply been lost, but deliberately removed. To understand the chilling depths of Elias Vance's actions, one must first delve into the shadows of his past, into the crucible of grief and loss that had warped his very soul. Before the war, Elias had been a different man. A proud landowner, a devoted husband, a man whose stern exterior softened considerably in the presence of his beloved wife, Clara. Clara Vance was, by all accounts, a woman of ethereal beauty and gentle spirit. Her hair was the color of spun moonlight. Her eyes a deep, intelligent blue. Her laughter, though rare, was said to be like the chime of tiny bells. She was the light of Elias's life, the anchor that held him steady in a world that could often feel chaotic. Nora, their only child, was born in 1861, just as the first rumblings of war began to shake the foundations of the nation. From the moment she was born, Nora was Clara's mirror image. As she grew, the resemblance became uncanny. The same delicate features, the same luminous hair, the same piercing blue eyes. It was a source of immense joy for Elias, a living testament to his love for Clara. Then came the war. Elias answered the call to arms, leaving his young wife and infant daughter behind. He marched with the Confederate forces, enduring the brutal campaigns, the endless marches, the horrifying carnage of battles that turned fields into charnel houses. He witnessed unspeakable acts, saw men he knew and respected fall, felt the cold grip of fear and despair. The war stripped him of his innocence, his optimism, and slowly, inexorably, began to chip away at his humanity. He returned in 1865 not with a hero's welcome, but to a silence far more devastating than any battlefield roar. Clara had died in 1863, while Elias was still fighting in Virginia. Not by bullet or cannon, but by the insidious grip of consumption, a disease that ravaged countless homes during those lean years. She had wasted away, leaving behind a heartbroken community and a bewildered 2-year-old Nora. Elias returned to an empty house, a ghost of the home he had left. The light had gone out of his life, leaving him adrift in a sea of profound, inconsolable grief. In the parlor of the Vance farmhouse, above the cold, unused fireplace, hung a large, exquisitely painted portrait of Clara. It depicted her as she was at the age of 14, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, her beauty radiant, her eyes full of youthful promise. It was a portrait Elias would stare at for hours, his gaze fixed on the image of his lost love, a silent communion with a past that could never be reclaimed. And as Nora grew, the resemblance to that portrait became almost unbearable for him. At 10, then 11, then 12, Nora was the living embodiment of his lost Clara, a precious, fragile echo. It was a resemblance that became both a comfort and a torment, a constant reminder of what he had lost, and a desperate, burgeoning desire to hold on to the only piece of her that remained. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that Elias Vance had made a decision so quiet, so methodical, so utterly devoid of mercy that it would have stopped the heart of anyone who understood it fully. He had decided that Nora would not be allowed to grow up. Not because he hated her, but because he loved Clara too much. The first subtle clues that something deliberate, something profoundly unnatural was occurring, began to surface in the fragmented memories of those who had once been close to the Vance household. Old Mr. Abernathy, the general store proprietor, a man whose memory was as long as his beard, recalled seeing Elias Vance at odd hours, not in town, but down by the creek that snaked through the woods bordering his property. Elias would be carrying a small woven basket, his head bent, his movements furtive. He seemed to be gathering something, not berries or mushrooms, but small, nondescript plants, their leaves a dull green, their stems thin and gray. Mr. Abernathy had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming Elias was collecting herbs for some home remedy, a common practice in those days. But the memory, once stirred by the whispers about Nora, now took on a more sinister hue. Then there was Clem Dudley, a burly, taciturn man who had worked as a farmhand on the Vance property for a few years after the war before moving on to find better wages. Clem, a man not easily rattled, remembered a strange, bitter smell that would occasionally emanate from the Vance kitchen. It wasn't the smell of cooking or of cleaning solutions. It was an earthy, acrid scent, almost medicinal, but with an underlying bitterness that made his nose wrinkle. He had seen Elias in the kitchen, hunched over a mortar and pestle, grinding something into a fine paste. Elias would always stop when Clem entered, his back stiffening, his movements becoming deliberately casual. Clem had dismissed it as Elias's eccentricities, another facet of the man's grief-stricken reclusiveness. But the memory of that smell, that secretive grinding, now felt like a cold knot in his stomach. And then there was Nora herself, her persistent fatigue, her unnerving pallor, the way her delicate skin seemed almost translucent. She was always quiet, always compliant, never complaining. Even when Elias insisted she drink a particular herbal tea each morning, or consume a spoonful of a thick, dark paste with her meals, Elias would watch her, his eyes intense, unblinking, as she swallowed the concoction without protest. He would tell her it was for her health, to keep her strong, to ward off the illnesses that had claimed her mother. And Nora, innocent and trusting, would obey. She was a child after all, and her father was her world, her only protector in a world that had taken everything else from her. The pieces were there, scattered like fallen leaves, waiting for someone with the intellect and the courage to gather them. The summer of 1879 brought with it not only the oppressive heat of Alabama, but also a new, unsettling tremor through the quiet rhythms of Harwick. Thomas Greer, a young man of 19, was a familiar and well-liked figure in town. He was the son of the local blacksmith, a strapping lad with a ready smile, a shock of unruly brown hair, and a natural charm that drew people to him. His attention had settled upon Nora Vance. It wasn't her vivacity that drew him, for Nora possessed little of that. Instead, it was her quiet mystery, her ethereal beauty, and the profound sadness that seemed to reside in her deep blue eyes. He had first truly noticed her at the annual church picnic, a rare occasion when Elias allowed Nora to venture beyond the confines of their property. Nora, then by the calendar 18 years old, still looked no older than a child of 12. But Thomas, with the romantic idealism of youth, saw past the physical anomaly. He saw her gentle spirit, her quiet intelligence, and a haunting beauty that made something in his chest ache. Their encounters were brief, furtive, and charged with the unspoken tension of a forbidden attraction. Thomas would find excuses to linger at the general store when he knew Elias and Nora might be there. He would offer a polite nod to Elias, then a shy, hopeful smile to Nora. Once he managed to drop a small, brightly colored ribbon near her feet, pretending it was an accident. Nora picked it up, her delicate fingers brushing his as she returned it, and for a moment their eyes met, a silent communication passing between them that neither could fully explain. Another time he saw her sketching by the creek, a rare moment of solitude for her. He approached cautiously, offering a few wild daisies he had picked. Nora accepted them, her cheeks flushing a faint rose, and for a few precious minutes they spoke, their voices low, almost conspiratorial. Thomas spoke of his dreams. Nora, in her soft, whispery voice, spoke of the books she read, of the stories she imagined. It was nothing. It was everything. And it was seen. Elias Vance's possessiveness of Nora had grown over the years, hardening into an impenetrable shell. He saw every glance, every whispered word, every fleeting smile as a threat to the carefully constructed world he had built around his daughter. He saw Thomas Greer not as a hopeful suitor, but as a predator, a force that threatened to steal away the last vestige of Clara that he clung to so desperately. One sweltering afternoon, Elias witnessed Thomas speaking to Nora outside the general store, a small bouquet of wild flowers in Thomas's hand. The scene, innocent as it was, ignited a cold fury in Elias. His face, usually impassive, contorted into a mask of barely suppressed rage. He strode toward them, his movement stiff and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the young man flinch. Nora. Elias's voice was low, dangerously calm. We are leaving. He did not acknowledge Thomas, did not even spare him a glance. He simply took Nora's arm, his grip firm, and led her away, leaving Thomas standing alone, the wild flowers still clutched in his hand, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. Then Thomas Greer disappeared. It was a Sunday evening, a week after the incident at the general store. Thomas had told his parents he was going for a walk, perhaps to clear his head. He was last seen by old Mr. Abernathy walking down the dusty road that led toward the Vance property. The setting sun cast long shadows before him. He never returned. The alarm was raised the next morning. Thomas's parents, frantic with worry, alerted Deputy Orrin Falk. Deputy Falk launched an immediate investigation. He organized search parties, combing the woods and fields surrounding Harwick, calling out Thomas's name until their voices were hoarse. He questioned everyone who had seen Thomas that evening. He spoke to Mr. Abernathy, who confirmed seeing Thomas heading toward the Vance farm. Naturally, Deputy Falk went to the Vance property. He found Elias Vance on his porch, calmly whittling a piece of wood. Nora seated quietly beside him reading. Elias greeted the deputy with his usual reserved politeness. When questioned about Thomas, Elias's face remained impassive. I saw no one, Deputy. Nora and I were at home all evening. We keep to ourselves. Nora, when asked, simply nodded, her eyes downcast, her voice a barely audible whisper. I saw no one, sir. Deputy Falk searched the Vance property with Elias's reluctant permission. He found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no discarded items, no freshly disturbed earth. The farmhouse and its surrounding land were meticulously kept, almost unnaturally so. The deputy left frustrated and deeply uneasy. There was no evidence, no proof, and yet the cold certainty of something terrible refused to leave him. The community's fear escalated dramatically. The whispers about Nora now mingled with terrified speculation about Thomas. Had he run off? Had he met with an accident? Or had something far more sinister occurred? The quiet, reclusive Elias Vance, once merely an object of pity and distant respect, now became a figure of dark suspicion. His unyielding control over Nora, his cold demeanor, his unwavering denial, all contributed to a growing sense of dread that settled over Harwick like a shroud. Dr. Holt, meanwhile, felt a cold knot of certainty tighten in his stomach. Thomas Greer's disappearance, coupled with his own unsettling observations of Nora Vance, solidified his growing suspicion. The medical anomaly, once a perplexing puzzle, now felt inextricably linked to a potential crime. He knew with a chilling certainty that he had to dig deeper, to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or devastating it might prove to be. The fate of Nora Vance, and perhaps of Thomas Greer, depended on it. Dr. Holt spent his evenings poring over medical texts, botanical guides, and any scientific journals he could lay his hands on, searching for any obscure condition, any rare plant, any forgotten folk remedy that might explain Nora's arrested development. His search was painstaking and often frustrating. The medical knowledge of the late 19th century, while advancing rapidly, still had vast, uncharted territories. He considered everything: rare genetic conditions, chronic illnesses, even the possibility of some exotic poison. But nothing quite fit. Nora exhibited no other symptoms of severe illness, only the profound and unsettling lack of physical maturation. Then a thought struck him with such force that he had to put down his pen and sit very still for a long moment. What if it wasn't a disease? What if it was a deliberate intervention? He drafted a meticulous letter to Dr. Leonard Price, a renowned botanist at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. In the letter, Dr. Holt described Nora's case in exhaustive detail: her apparent age versus her chronological age, the complete absence of secondary sexual characteristics, her pallor, her quiet, almost lethargic demeanor, and the lack of any other overt disease symptoms. He then posed a careful, pointed series of questions, asking if Dr. Price knew of any plants native to Alabama or the wider South that were known to have effects on human growth, development, or hormonal systems, particularly those that might suppress puberty or cause a stunting of physical maturation. He emphasized the unusual nature of the case and hinted, carefully, at the possibility of deliberate administration. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Then a letter arrived from Tuscaloosa, its envelope bearing the university's seal. Dr. Holt tore it open with trembling hands. Dr. Price's reply was detailed, scholarly, and utterly devastating. Dr. Price suggested a particular plant, Lithospermum ruderale, commonly known as stone seed or wayside gromwell. He explained that while its properties were not fully understood by Western medicine, it had a long and documented history of use among various indigenous peoples of North America, particularly for its effects on fertility. He wrote of tribal women using infusions of the plant to suppress menstruation and prevent conception, and of its use in some cultures to delay puberty in young girls or even to induce a state of prolonged childhood. Dr. Price went on to explain that recent, albeit limited, scientific inquiries into Lithospermum ruderale had begun to identify certain alkaloids within the plant that were believed to interfere with the pituitary gland and consequently the thyroid. He described how a suppressed thyroid could lead to a host of symptoms: stunted growth, delayed sexual development, lethargy, pallor, and a general slowing of all metabolic processes. He noted that prolonged exposure, especially during critical developmental periods, could have profound and potentially irreversible effects on an individual's physical maturation. The plant, he added, was relatively common in the region, often found growing in dry open woodlands and along creek beds. Dr. Holt read the letter once, then a second time. His hands gripped the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every symptom Nora exhibited suddenly made horrifying sense. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Elias Vance wasn't just a grieving father. He was a deliberate architect of his daughter's arrested development. He was feeding her a compound systematically, methodically, year after year, to keep her forever young, forever a child, forever the spitting image of his lost Clara at 14. The realization was a punch to the gut. The intellectual satisfaction of solving a medical mystery was utterly eclipsed by the profound horror of the truth. This was not an illness. It was an act of prolonged, calculated cruelty disguised as care. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Dr. Holt sought out Clem Dudley that very evening. He found Clem at the local tavern, nursing a glass of whiskey. Dr. Holt pulled up a chair and spoke in a low, earnest tone, explaining his concerns about Nora and the strange circumstances surrounding the Vance household. He mentioned the plant, the bitter smell, the paste. Clem, initially wary and reluctant to speak ill of a former employer, slowly began to open up under Dr. Holt's persistent but gentle questioning. "I remember the smell vividly," Clem recounted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Like bitter earth and something else, something sharp, doctor. That made your eyes water if you got too close." He described seeing Elias, often late at night, hunched over a small wooden mortar and pestle in the kitchen, grinding dried plant material into a fine powder, then mixing it with a little water to form a thick, dark paste. He'd always be real quiet about it, and he'd always stop if I came in. But I saw him, doctor, more than once, and I saw him put a spoonful of that paste into Nora's morning tea, or sometimes mix it into her porridge. He'd watch her drink it too, real close, like he was making sure she got every drop. Clem also recalled Elias going down to the creek bed, often with a small basket, returning with bundles of small, unassuming plants with dull green leaves. He called it Nora's tonic, Clem finished, a shiver running through his burly frame. Said it was to keep her strong like her mama. But it always felt wrong somehow, always. The confrontation was inevitable, a storm that had been gathering for years, now ready to break. Dr. Holt arrived at the Vance farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, the air heavy and still, the silence of the property almost suffocating. He found Elias Vance in his study, a small, austere room filled with books on history and military strategy. The portrait of Clara Vance, forever 14, gazed down from the wall. Elias looked up from his ledger, his face impassive, his eyes betraying no surprise at the unannounced visit. He simply gestured to a chair. "Mr. Vance," Dr. Holt began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I have come to speak with you about Nora and about certain irregularities." Elias closed his ledger, placing it precisely on the desk. "Irregularities, doctor. I assure you, Nora is in excellent health. You yourself examined her." His tone was calm, almost dismissive. A subtle challenge. "Indeed I did," Dr. Holt replied, meeting Elias's gaze and holding it. "And my examination, coupled with further research, has led me to a most disturbing conclusion. Mr. Vance, I know about the Lithospermum ruderaale." The name hung in the air between them. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Elias's eyes. A cold recognition. But it was fleeting, and he simply leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped, his posture still rigid. "And what precisely do you know about it, doctor?" Dr. Holt laid out his findings methodically, clinically. He spoke of Dr. Price's letter, of the plant's properties, its alkaloids, its effects on the thyroid and pituitary glands, its documented use in suppressing development. He spoke of Nora's symptoms, how they perfectly aligned with prolonged exposure. He spoke of Clem Dudley's testimony, of the bitter paste, of the morning tea. He left no detail unsaid, no piece of evidence unpresented. When Dr. Holt finished, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Elias Vance remained utterly still, his gaze fixed on the portrait of Clara. Then he slowly turned his head, his eyes cold and unblinking, meeting Dr. Holt's across the desk. "You believe I have poisoned my daughter, Doctor?" Elias asked, his voice devoid of emotion, almost conversational. "I believe you have deliberately stunted her growth, Mr. Vance." Dr. Holt corrected, his voice firm. "To keep her a child, to keep her as she was." He gestured subtly toward the portrait. Elias smiled then, a thin, chilling smile that did not reach his eyes. He rose from his chair, walking slowly toward the portrait of Clara, his back to Dr. Holt. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, almost a monologue, filled with a chilling blend of grief, obsession, and terrifying logic. "Clara," he began, his hand reaching out to gently trace the painted cheek of his wife. "She was everything. The light, the warmth, the very air I breathed. And then the war took her, not with a bullet, but with a cough, a fever, a slow, agonizing fade. I was away fighting for a cause already lost. While she was dying alone, I returned to an empty house, Doctor. An empty, echoing tomb. Only Nora remained. A tiny, fragile echo of her mother." He turned then, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made Dr. Holt instinctively recoil. "And as Nora grew, she became more and more like Clara. At 14, she was Clara, precisely as she was in that portrait. The same eyes, the same hair, the same delicate features. It was a miracle, Doctor, a second chance. A piece of Clara returned to me." His voice dropped, becoming almost tender in its terrifying sincerity. "But time is a thief, Doctor. It would have stolen her from me again. It would have taken that precious image, that last vestige of Clara, and transformed it into something else. A woman who would grow and change and eventually leave me, just as Clara did. I could not bear it. I could not lose her again." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Dr. Holt as if genuinely expecting understanding. "So I found a way, an old way, a forgotten way. The plants by the creek, the knowledge passed down. I researched. I experimented. I found the means to preserve her, to keep her safe from the ravages of time, to keep her pure, Doctor, untouched, forever 14, forever Clara." The logic was terrifying in its clarity, its complete absence of moral compass. He genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. He saw it not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of profound, desperate love. He had sacrificed his daughter not out of hatred, but out of an obsession so consuming it had devoured every last remnant of his humanity. "And I will not allow anyone to take that from me," Elias continued, his voice hardening. "Not you, not the town, not anyone." His eyes narrowed, a veiled threat hanging unspoken in the air between them. "Some things are best left undisturbed, Doctor. For everyone's sake." Doctor. Holt felt a cold dread seep into his bones. It wasn't just the confession. It wasn't just the admission of what Elias had done. It was the man's complete, utter lack of remorse. He was not a madman raving. He was a man utterly convinced of the righteousness of his actions. His grief had twisted his perception of reality into something monstrous. He had committed an unspeakable act, and he saw it as a sacred duty. The next morning, Dr. Holt sought out Deputy Orrin Falk. He laid out the entire horrifying narrative, the scientific explanation, the letter from Dr. Price, Clem Dudley's eyewitness testimony, and finally Elias's chilling confession. Deputy Falk listened in stunned silence, his usual stoic demeanor slowly crumbling into a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "You mean he's been poisoning his own daughter, Doctor, to keep her looking like her dead mother?" Deputy Falk moved swiftly. He obtained a warrant, a rare and serious step in quiet Harwick, and returned to the Vance property with a small contingent of men. This time, Elias Vance offered no resistance. His face was a mask of cold resignation. He watched, impassive, as Deputy Falk and his men searched the farmhouse. What they found in the cellar, beneath a loose floorboard, were bundles of dried Lithospermum ruderale, carefully preserved. Beside them, a small worn mortar and pestle, still bearing traces of a dark earthy residue. And then, in a locked drawer in Elias's study, they discovered a small leather-bound journal. It was not a diary of emotions, but a meticulous record in Elias's precise hand, detailing the dosages, the frequency of administration, and Nora's physical responses over the years. Entries like Nora's height unchanged this quarter. Good, her skin remains smooth. The dosage is correct. And then, more chillingly, a young man, Thomas Greer, showed undue interest in Nora today. Must ensure her purity is maintained. The dosage will be increased slightly for a week. The journal was a cold, clinical testament to a monstrous obsession. A record kept with the same detached precision one might apply to a scientific experiment. The subject of that experiment was his own daughter. With the evidence secured, Deputy Falk and Dr. Holt gently, but firmly removed Nora from the Vance farmhouse. She was brought to Dr. Holt's office, away from her father's suffocating presence. Dr. Holt spoke to her softly, kindly, explaining in simple terms what they had discovered. He told her about the plant, about its effects, about how it had kept her body from growing as it should. He watched her face, expecting confusion, perhaps anger, perhaps denial. What he saw instead was a profound, heartbreaking understanding. "I knew," she said, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Her voice, usually a whisper, carried a terrible clarity. "I knew I was different. The other girls, they grew. Their bodies changed. But mine stayed the same. Father said it was a special tonic to keep me healthy, like Mama. He said Mama was beautiful and I was just like her, and he wanted me to stay that way." A single tear traced a path down her delicate cheek. "I felt tired sometimes, and hungry, but not for food, just tired. But I loved my father. He was all I had. He loved Mama so much. I thought he was keeping me safe. I didn't understand that it was wrong. She was a child who had been denied her childhood, a woman who had been denied her womanhood. All by the hand of the man who claimed to love her most. Her resignation, her terrible, quiet acceptance of her fate, was more devastating than any outburst of rage could ever have been. The question of Thomas Greer, though never explicitly answered by Elias, now hung heavy in the air, a silent, chilling implication. The journal entry, the increased dosage after Thomas's interest in Nora, the lack of any trace of the young man, and the discovery of disturbed near the creek bed where Thomas was last seen walking, all pointed in one terrible direction. No body was ever found. No definitive proof of Elias's direct involvement was established. But in the quiet, knowing glances exchanged between Dr. Holt and Deputy Falk, the truth was understood. Thomas Greer had become another casualty of Elias Vance's monstrous devotion. A threat, quietly and permanently eliminated to preserve a twisted vision that had long since crossed every boundary of love into something that had no name in the law books of 1879. The trial was a spectacle. Elias Vance, true to form, remained impassive throughout, his testimony a chilling repetition of his twisted logic. He had acted out of love, he said, to preserve the memory of his wife, to protect his daughter from the harsh realities of the world. Dr. Holt testified, presenting his scientific findings and the journal entries. Clem Dudley recounted his observations, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. And Nora, fragile and quiet, gave her testimony, her soft words echoing the profound sadness of her stolen youth. In the end, Elias Vance was convicted of aggravated assault and child endangerment, but not murder. The jury, a mix of townspeople and farmers, struggled with the nuances of a case unlike anything the law had ever been asked to consider. Some saw him as a monster. Others, God help them, as a broken man driven mad by grief. He was sentenced to a term in the state penitentiary, a punishment that to many felt woefully inadequate for the years of psychological and physical imprisonment he had inflicted upon his own child. Nora was taken in by a distant cousin's family in Tuscaloosa, a kind, elderly couple who offered her a quiet refuge. The transition was difficult. She was withdrawn, her voice rarely rising above a whisper, her eyes still holding that ancient sorrow. She had missed years of normal development, years of social interaction, years of simply being allowed to be. As the lithospermum compound gradually left her system, her body began a belated, hesitant attempt at maturation. She grew a few more inches. Her features softened slightly, but she never truly caught up to her chronological age. She remained small, delicate, with the unnerving stillness that had become her hallmark. She lived a quiet life in Tuscaloosa, never marrying, never having children, forever marked by the years of her father's twisted devotion. Dr. Holt, haunted by the case, kept a final entry in his journal, his handwriting now more reflective than clinical. The Vance case closes, but its shadows linger. Science provided the explanation, but could not mend the broken spirit. Nora Vance, a victim of a love so profound it became monstrous. Her body may slowly begin to catch up, but the years stolen, the experiences denied, can never be reclaimed. A chilling reminder that the human heart, in its darkest grief, can twist even the purest intentions into unspeakable acts. May God have mercy on her soul, and on his. The unresolved question of Thomas Greer remained a dark stain on Harwick's history. His disappearance was never fully explained, his body never found. His parents grieved until their dying days, forever wondering what became of their son. The town of Harwick tried, in its own way, to forget. The story of Nora Vance became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones around crackling fires, its details distorted and embellished with each retelling. But the truth, the quiet and terrible truth, was this. In a faded gray farmhouse at the edge of a small Alabama town, a man had looked at his daughter and seen only the ghost of the woman he had lost. He had decided with a coldness that masqueraded as love that the ghost was worth more than the girl. And in doing so, he had stolen from Nora Vance the one thing that no science, no law, and no act of human kindness could ever fully restore. Her life, lived as it was meant to be lived, in the natural, relentless, beautiful forward march of time. Some things once taken cannot be given back, and some forms of love, when they curdle into obsession, become indistinguishable from the darkest cruelty imaginable. That is the story of Nora Vance, the girl who never aged, and the man who made absolutely certain of it.